CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's up, gang, and welcome to another edition of CFL 110 on the Winnipeg Sports Talk YouTube channel and podcast network, brought to you by Garage Living Winnipeg. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton. A wild week last week in the Canadian Football League and some huge games coming up this weekend, and we're going to be all over it for the next 45 minutes or so. Great to have you with us. We appreciate you joining us. To everyone that was with us on the Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily Show, as well as people from across the country joining us to talk about all the big stories in 3-down football. CFL 110 is brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg, our great sponsors that have made this show possible this year. And, of course, our great friend Pat Kanuga, longtime member of the morning show over on CBC, and now living his dream, transforming garages of car nuts and Winnipeggers alike into a spot that completely revolutionizes their workspace and their home. Pat's been actually getting calls from many WSTers and CFL 110 listeners. Well, the summer seems like it's kind of just getting underway. They're booking jobs into September already. So if you're interested in an extreme garage makeover or a minor one before winter, give Pat a call at 204-999-1234. Garage Living can help clear the clutter so you have a clean, organized, gorgeous space to work and hang out, maybe even have the guys over for the big game, and that can happen in just a few days. Garage Living specializes in durable, polyaspartic floor coatings, premium, made in Canada metal cabinets, slat wall and overhead storage solutions for a functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. Whether it's a single, double, triple, or heck, a 10-car garage mahal, Pat can come up with a design to meet your needs within your budget. For more information, check out their amazing work at garageliving.com and give Pat a call for a free in-garage consultation at 204-999-1234. Garage Living Winnipeg, garages made for living. All right, let's get into it. Hammer, what's going on? How are you?
Good, my friend. Just back at it after a week off vacation, feeling rejuvenated, feeling good. Get ready to get back on the sports beat, get back, head to Toronto tomorrow. So more Bombers coverage this week, but looking forward to breaking down. Even though I was off, man, I certainly didn't take the weekend off. What a weekend of games it was.
Well, and listen, we'll get to the games on the weekend, including one involving the Bombers and the Argos, both who lost to their arch rivals last week. And listen, I'm sort of with you. I try to avoid talking too much about officiating. I know how difficult the job is. I know how challenging it is at every level of all sports to get people to do what is more often than not an absolutely thankless job. But there was no way around it. Coming out of the games on the weekend, officiating was under fire. I mean, certainly a couple PI calls in the Winnipeg Saskatchewan game that were head scratching to say the least, and flags everywhere in that BC Calgary game as well.
Yeah, like you said off the top, I mean, it's not a topic I like to wade into. I don't like, criticizing officiating. I'm with everybody else who watches the games. I mean, my eyes roll during points that I feel like it's taking far too long for the officials to either get a call right or, there's parts of the command center where it feels like, well, what exactly is their role? Are they supposed to come in and correct, everything? And they seem to be asleep at the wheel at some points. And, that's just going to happen in this league, but, or any sports league for that matter. But it just seemed like this weekend and this season a little bit as, it's becoming a bit of a narrative, and it's not just one fan base that's beefing about it or one team that's beefing about it. I'm hearing it from city to city. And, you mentioned the Calgary BC game, there's 23 flags in that game. It felt like, every second play you were seeing laundry hit the field and a call being made by the official. And, whether it's the CFL or any pro sports league or any league in general, I mean, the refs aren't supposed to be part of the game, and we just felt that too much. And there's a couple things in particular from this weekend and this season as a whole that I think is, adding to the narrative. Is, one thing in particular has been the calls for pass interference. I honestly don't know if coaches know what pass interference is or the officials know what pass interference is. And what we're seeing far too often are these flags being thrown almost as if like, okay, well, video replay will clean it up if I'm wrong, if it's close enough, right? I mean, it's kind of like if you wanted to call holding, it's long understood. If you wanted to call holding, you could call holding on every single play that there is, right? If you want to get very, very, very specific when it comes to pass interference, you can drill a guy who might have his hand on your arm, right? That's touching your arm. That's technically not legal, but it's allowed, right? And on more than a play, so long as the player isn't being impeded to make that catch. And the issue, I think, and certainly something that, I understand the Bombers have been inquiring about, other teams across the league as well, is that when they do challenge what they believe to be a weak PI call, in every single case, unless it was such a blatantly missed call that the ref just didn't see, they'll always lean on that little tug or that little grab. And unless you have indisputable proof, because remember, a reverse challenge does not make the official look good in this case. They don't want to have the officials making plays and then the coaches having to, essentially fix the call for them. So it's becoming a bit of an issue right now across the league that these pass interference calls are being made, and because the evidence is there, it's not being overturned. So players and teams are not even going that extra step in throwing the flag out, but it's also slowing down games. It's changing games. Like I felt, Huss, on a couple different games this weekend, that it was almost like when you see the guy come out in a Speedo in WWE and he's fighting, an old school WWE, and he's fighting a brand name, that whatever momentum the guy in the Speedo is wearing, he ain't going to get the call. He ain't going to get the win. So it almost feels like it's like, let's make for these exciting games. Let's have this big impactful play that might have a little bit of contact, end up being a flag thrown, and the game turns on its head. So I just think it's, again, I know we're spending some time here talking about officiating and going against what we were talking about, but I do think it's something that isn't a massive, massive problem, but it's becoming an issue that teams have been voicing, their displeasure over, and it certainly is a story to keep an eye on. It might be a bigger issue down the road.
Yeah, I mean, listen, in a game that was very, very tight, I mean, a couple of phantom PI calls in the Winnipeg Saskatchewan game had a lot of people talking. And listen, I even go back to the previous week, Winnipeg playing Calgary. And Mike O'Shea, I still maintain, the most insane challenge I've ever seen. He successfully challenged a play that ended up costing him 2 yards, but it was to make a point. And listen, if you're in a situation where you're willing to eat a couple yards and risk a challenge to make a statement, I think that shows where some of the coaches are right now on it. And
especially for Mike O'Shea, Huss. He's part of the rules committee, and he, like us, like we started, is not one to make an example of the officiating. If he wants to make an example or maybe better put, discuss his issue or his beef, he does it weekly on phone calls to the officials. He never makes them a public example. And I think that was a direct result of him just being fed up on some of the calls this year.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it is a huge challenge moving forward for Randy Ambrosie in the league to continue to improve the level of officiating in this league. And part of me thinks, well, maybe we can expand the challenge, give the coaches an extra challenge. Bottom line, we want to get things right. But to your point, more often than not, challenges, I mean, the call has to be so egregious to be overturned. I'm not really sure that does change everything. It was neat seeing Wally Buono honored this week by the Stamps, going under the Wall of Fame as a builder. And during the interview, Buono was asked what he'd do if he was commissioner for a day, to which the veteran manager and coach said he would revisit U.S. expansion. The CFL's been trying to find a 10th team in Canada. Should they listen to Wally we're still waiting for the Maritimes to happen, and I'm not sure that ever is going to be. Is it even worth the conversation to think about potentially looking south of the border?
I think we kind of had this conversation a few years ago with the XFL and whether or not there was going to be a potential merger. And we know it was more than just smoke, just the way in which, some pretty, insiders, TSN was, reporting as much, right? That they felt it was going that way. Usually you can trust those, those takes. And it didn't pan out. It created a lot of dialogue about what that would look like. And I mean, it's hard not to look at U.S. expansion. That, first of all, I was surprised that Wally kind of brought it up. I'm not saying he's rah Canadian flag. He is rah CFL. So if he's coming up with something, he's not just pulling it out of his butt and just saying, yeah, I think we should just go down south. He's thought about it to make that claim. So, but it's hard to think of U.S. expansion in 2024 and not go back 30 years to 1993, 94. Early 90s when they did this experiment. Now, there are some key differences, Huss, from then and now. Then the CFL, or back then the CFL was on life support. They needed those expansion fees. They were willing to give teams to, let's call it, less than ideal owners.
The Gleibermans.
The Gleibermans, to be an example, might be the best example. And even though it only lasted to 96, there was a bunch of things that just wouldn't fly today that flew 33 decades ago. Those being, of course, the U.S. teams didn't have to follow the CFL unique rules. They didn't have to have an X amount of Canadians on their team. They didn't have to, it was a bit of a shit show. And then there was the teams that even within that few years that expansion existed, there were teams that were going bankrupt and popping up in other cities and moving and so I think what Wally Buono was getting at, and what I think was a big part of that XFL CFL potential merger, was that there is 40 million people in Canada and there's 40 million people in the state of California. Like the idea of going international is appealing. The problem with going international, of course, is that traditional league. And anyone who's a traditionalist, anybody who loves the CFL for what it is, isn't going to be on board. And that's unfortunately for the CFL right now, a large percentage of their fan base of people who tune in week to week. I think the appeal in the US is if you can get more eyeballs of looking at this league because it's so exciting, because it's so unique, if you can find a way to have expansion, if that's the route that the CFL eventually goes. I'm not advocating for it, but if that is the route that they go, they're going to have to maintain a lot of the unique rules in the CFL. Like, that's just what makes the CFL the CFL. Now, can you give and take on some things? Absolutely. But some of those foundational things that make the game as exciting and as fast-paced as it is would need to stay. Like, what do you think? You would know better than me about what it was like back in the early 90s.
I mean, listen, it was a circus. Like, as a young football fan, it was sort of neat to see all the new teams and the logos. And listen, I'll say this to CFL fans, and oh my God, I should remember what the I think it was a Calgary. There's a YouTube channel in I think out of Calgary,
okay,
that plays a whole bunch of old CFL broadcasts, and I remember watching a game, the Bombers going down to Shreveport to play the Pirates. There's like a Sacramento Gold Miners game. There's like the biggest posse. It was poorly done. The teams were poorly managed, and that inevitably led to the death of most of those teams. And, the Baltimore situation was the one that was a little different. They had strong management. They were supported well. And they ended up sticking around in the league longer than the other teams, and inevitably winning the Grey Cup is the one team that didn't have that. But you cannot have different rules for different teams. So, like, doing it the way they did before, I don't think is going to fly. I would, however, if you told me that the rules of the game were not changing and we were still going to have the bigger field and it's 3 downs. I mean, essentially, you're bringing in more teams that are playing on the same playing field. I would, I guess, entertain the conversation. To me, I think what would work far better than saying, hey, we're going to go and, we're adding another 6 or 8 teams.
Totally.
If you identified, say, 3 markets relatively close to the border that, wouldn't add massive, like 3 and 4 hour flights for teams.
You couldn't go straight down to Texas. You know what I mean? Like,
no, exactly. Like say Portland. Like Seattle has XFL and they've got the NFL, but say a team like Portland wanted to come in. That could be the sort of a market that might work.
Windsor?
I think about, pardon me?
Like a Windsor, or is that too close to Canada?
Well, I mean, just across the Detroit, you've got if you wanted to go across into Michigan, right. There might be a spot there. I'm thinking maybe upstate New York. Like I know Albany has had teams. Well, I mean, they of course had that Arena League team that Antonio Brown bought and bankrupted, and
here's the problem: the more we talk about and bring up names, the less interested I am of CFL expansion. It's
but the thing is, you want to have places that it will work, that places that might be more knowledgeable, like about the Canadian Football League game, of the teams that they're playing.
Geographical rivalries too. There,
well,
even
exactly.
If you bring up Portland, that can be a BC rivalry real quick.
Well, and I think about the Prairies here, and we've all been down to Grand Forks and Fargo, and they've got the Dome in Fargo, and they've got an NDSU football program that continuously challenges and often wins the FCS championship. Yeah. Now, it might be difficult to make all of these teams have X amount of Canadians on their roster, but if you were looking for a middle ground, they can have Canadians that will count towards the ratio. For instance, say there was a team in Fargo, and you've got a natural rivalry with Winnipeg. Saskatchewan is not too far. Maybe instead of Canadians, it's Canadians and a certain catchment area, which includes players from North Dakota or Minnesota that have played through there, that have some connections that might actually help them sell tickets. Like, I don't rule it out of hand. I would if you're talking about changing the game, because I'm with you. I think the uniqueness of the Canadian Football League is what it makes the CFL. Right. But I think there probably is some interesting conversations to have about possibilities of some markets that would fit better within the framework of the Canadian Football League, that could work with Canadian talent, as well as something that would be relatively fair, that might also help those teams put some butts in seats. So
that's my issue with expansion, though, is that, like, I know you can say the good things. So you mentioned 3 teams would be ideal. 1 team would be ideal, given how long Randy Ambrosius talked about getting a 10th team and what that would do for even scheduling and all those things, right? I mean, we know the benefits of having expansion fees. We know the benefits of international, but it would take a lot of work to find some of those answers that you're so adequately presenting. Like that's the kind of market research that you would have to do for it to be a success. The one thing you can't be is just wing it. And we know the CFL has winged it on certain things. I'm not going to necessarily say they winged it, in the early 90s. I think that was more of a desperate situation that they just, kind of became available and they had no other choice but to
Who's got checks?
Who's got checks? Who's got money? Exactly. The CFL, while not bursting with cash, is not in the same predicament. And so they can be a little bit, again, we're kind of talking like as if they're going to head to the US next season. But I do think it's intriguing. And I'll end it with this, is that Wally Bono is still very much a influential voice in the Canadian Football League. Just because he's no longer managing a team does not mean that other teams haven't used him as a consultant. And certainly the league would not ignore anything he'd have to say, nor do I believe Wally Bono, if you knew anything about Wally, is just walking away in retirement and not sharing his opinion about the future of a league he's dedicated a majority of his professional life to.
No, it's great. I mean, to me, I think there's a geography component to it. There's an ownership component to it. And there's rules that make it fair for everybody involved. And listen, I'd be interested in talking a little bit more about it. But as I said, there's a long way to go and a lot of work. And you'd have to have someone, whether it's the commissioner or someone deputized by him, to tick off all the boxes before you can really seriously be starting talking about that as a possibility. You mentioned winging it. One guy that hasn't been winging it like he has in the past is Zach Caleros, who right now is a 1-5 record as a starter this year for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. 2 touchdowns, 7 picks, coming off a rough one against the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Jeff, this is a guy that has been routinely, since he came to Winnipeg, and really was the catalyst of turning around a team that hadn't won in 30 years to a Grey Cup champion and a team that's been in the last 4 Grey Cups. The guy, he's been off his game so far this year. We had a great chat earlier on Winnipeg Sports Talk this week with Doug Brown about concerns on Zach. What do you make of the early start of the season for the Bombers quarterback and how that has influenced the Bombers record, which is upside down from what we're used to?
Look, I think, we're now 7 games into the season, so it's not rust, right? It's not, okay, that's a couple games here. Zach didn't play preseason, so maybe he's just trying to get into a rhythm. I'm not ready to pull the panic button. I don't want to add to the narrative that somehow Zach Collaros is now an old man and can't throw a football and can't run an offense like maybe he used to in the last few years. Again, is it concerning? Absolutely.
He looked great late in the Calgary game.
It's concerning that the Bombers are 2-5 when a lot of people imagine the Bombers would be even better than 5-2 at this point in the season. So, they're not getting the best play from Zach. I'd be a lot more concerned, if Kenny Lawler and Dalton Schoen, 2 guys that were, his best receivers, arguably the best receivers in the league, were in the lineup. I think what really hurts with those guys, the reality is Zach does some of his best work on the run. He does some of his best work improvising when he's escaping the pocket. And who is the number one target that he seems to find when he escapes the pocket? It's Dalton Schoen. And, other people might say, well, he also finds Drew Wolotarski. Yeah, well, he finds Drew Wolotarski because Dalton Schoen's being covered by 1 or 2 guys. There's a reason why, Drew Wolotarski's open in that case. And so you look at the moving pieces on the O-line, you look at the inconsistency in the run game. I think, you can question some play calling and lack of creativity from Buck Pierce, defensive coordinator. I think when you put all those things together, I think it looks a lot worse. And at this point, I've heard on shows in other markets and other leagues about when do they pull the rope, and when do they give up on Zach Collaros, essentially, is the question being asked. And I can tell you out of practice today from Buck Pierce, that's not going to be anytime soon. They're riding with Zach. It's, he's their guy.
They wouldn't have even considered that.
Never. And so, and the thing I think that's kind of wild in all this is I get it. Like, Zach hasn't played well. And it isn't just a matter of not playing well and not playing like the guy we've seen the last few years in a Bombers jersey. He's made some very, very, big issue plays. Like he's made bad decisions, stuff that he didn't used to do, bad turnovers. He's become a bit of a turnover machine in the red zone. So, these things are legit. But it's just like, this is a guy who could have very well been the Bombers nominee for most outstanding player. And before that was back-to-back, MOP. So, at this point, yes, it's concerning, but he gives you a better opportunity to win games at this point than a Chris Streveler. I've been on record, Huss, including this past Monday, believing that Chris Streveler needs to have a bigger package in games. And that's not just because, Zach Collaros is struggling. It's because they need an injection of energy and a boost. And Chris Streveler does that. The one thing I've noticed the most about Zach this season, because if you watch him in practice, he's crisp. He's on play, but he's incredibly frustrated. And it's bleeding into games. Guys are either not in the right position, they're not getting open, whatever it might be. The onus does fall on 8. He is the leader of the offense. But at this point, I think until Kenny Lawler gets back, which is probably going to be in August, until this O-line kind of figures things out, until they can establish a consistent running game, that also needs to coincide with improving the passing game. But until they get some of those elements back, I'm not have a harsh assessment of Zach Collaros as other people out there.
There were some, and listen, I think I maybe talked about the one play where he had Wilson wide open, and it took a long time for that ball to get there. I think, to be fair, he was sort of throwing off his back foot at the time. But at times, like, the pop hasn't maybe seemed like it's been there before, but it's been the mistakes and the turnovers. And I think part of that is dealing with an offensive line that is getting better, but certainly wasn't anywhere close to what it's been in recent years early on. And then, with over $500,000 a receiver on the bench and new guys that, Zach didn't have connection and confidence in, it's taken a little while longer. Bottom line for Winnipeg, though, is they're 2-5 right now. They got the Argos on the weekend and then a home and home against the British Columbia Lions. And they don't have the luxury that they've been in for the last 4 seasons, where they're right there in first place and they got to win football games. They got to figure out a way to make the playoffs first and foremost. And, hopefully from a Bomber perspective, if the hardships early on in the season can kind of forge them to be a much more difficult team to play later on, that'll be a good thing. But it is going to start with the offense, and they are going to need better play from their starting quarterback. I've been impressed with the defense, which has kept them in games. And listen, you give up 19 in the CFL, you should win that football game. They didn't last week against the Riders. And as we transition to the Riders, before we talk about their great start to the season, let's talk about how that game ended. I know it was something we touched on the Winnipeg Sports Talk show on Monday, but this is still a hot topic around the league, and certainly I would imagine across the border from where we are in Saskatchewan. Shea Paterson running around at the end of the game, not throwing the football, getting hit by Adam Bighill, who did fall on him as he was tackling. Like, I really do think that at a different point in the game, that might have been flagged. In the NFL, probably has been flagged, but it wasn't. And interestingly enough, Shea Paterson, Corey Mace sort of took it upon themselves for the reason why it got to that point. But I know you've talked to people around the entire league about this. Fair or foul, Adam Bighill playing to the whistle and reminding Shea Paterson about 2 upcoming games between those teams as the clock struck 0 in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, the consensus has been purely fair. I mean, it's just and it's based off of comments that Mike O'Shea made after the game, Adam Bighill made after the game. More importantly, Shea Paterson and Corey Mace made after the game. Comments Adam made yesterday following practice, and it was so preventable. It was completely preventable. There was 5 seconds left on the clock in a 10-point game. There was no way the Winnipeg Blue Bombers were going to come back. You just need to have better time management. You're risking Shea Paterson, your quarterback of the near future here, present future, his health by allowing him to hold on to a ball in a nothing play. I mean, even if this is what I can't fathom. And it was great that we got the perfect example the next night on Sunday on what to do in a play like that, because that's what Calgary did. They backed up and they launched the ball into the stands. And I mean, Shea Paterson needs to know that. I don't care if you've been playing football for 15 years or 15 minutes. You need to know that in that situation, you just need to step back. It's 2, 3, and launch the ball. It's going to be 2 seconds. So what if you leave a second left on the clock? The Winnipeg Blue Bombers are not going to be the first team in football history to score 10 points in 1 second. Like, there was really no risk to the game at that point. And could Adam Bighill have eased up? Could there have been a gentlemanly situation where you just kind of, okay, we know we're not coming back. I'm chasing this guy. He must know better. I'm not going to finish the play. No, because Mike O'Shea has been asking the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to execute, or improve their execution. Stopping on a play when the game is live is not how Adam Bighill or the rest of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers should be hardwired. And I don't need to remind you, Huss, this is a rivalry game. So if you don't think that tempers were flaring at the end while this rookie quarterback was running out, beyond the time that he needed to, being chased down by one of the harder hitting linebackers in this game, made his own bed. And again, if I'm speaking to anybody, it's to fans who are upset about it, because none of the players are upset about it. No harm, no foul, learned lesson. That's just something you need to get rid of. I mean, is there any other explanation of that, Huss? Like,
no, there isn't. And listen, it's important to note how hot the rivalry is between the two teams. What's happened over the last 4 years, how big of a win that was for Saskatchewan. And you know what? I mean, yeah, some guys are going to kind of get hot, and there might be some pushing or shoving. Bring on Labor Day, bring on the Banjo Bowl. I mean, the good thing is Paterson wasn't hurt. I mean, we all move on. But let me say this. If I'm a head coach in that same situation with a double-digit lead with 5 seconds left in the game, with my backup quarterback that I need in the game, he's on the bench. I'm bringing my punter in. Punt the damn thing. You'll get 5 seconds off the clock. Punt it out of bounds, whatever. I mean, to me, it's about risk management. And that was terrible risk management by the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And whether this is the coach, the offensive coordinator, the quarterback, it was so easily avoidable. It wasn't avoided. It's going to add a little more gas to the fire when we head to Regina for Labor Day weekend. But I'll say this, my takeaway wasn't about that game. It was about the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And we move on to this team. They have had a complete culture change under Corey Mace. And again, those of you that know me, or if you're watching from outside, I mean, I'm a Winnipeg guy. We've had such a great time watching what the Bombers have done for the last number of years. And listen, we know what the rivalry's like between these clubs. It's even more special when you beat your most hated rival, and the Bombers have done a lot of that lately. That win by Saskatchewan, without Trevor Harris, without Jamarcus Hardrick, led by a defense that held Winnipeg to 9 points, to me, if there was anyone wondering whether this team was for real or a Grey Cup contender, they got their answer on Friday night, and this team is going to be getting more healthier going forward. They are absolutely in the right direction under their new leader. And listen, with BC losing, I know a lot of people wanted to just say, oh, look at what's happened with the Bombers. BC is going to be winning the West. Do not sleep on the Saskatchewan Roughriders right now. It was a statement game on Friday, and they're going to have plenty of opportunities to make more statements going forward. And this team is going to be a tough out once we get to the CFL Western Division playoffs.
Yeah, so belief is a dangerous thing, and belief was the 13th man in the Bombers for a long time, because it's that belief on the sideline that no matter where the game goes, and we know how many twists and turns a CFL game can take, that you still have that confidence that you're able to pull it out. And that's what I see with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. That's what I see with the Montreal Alouettes over in the East. Mind you, they did get their lunch money stolen this past week. I guess they were off on the bye week before going on the bye week. But that's where their bread and butter has been this season. It's been that belief. It's been that no matter who goes down, that next man up mentality. You hear it from all 9 teams, but it only really gets backed up by those really good teams that often find themselves in the Grey Cup game by the end of the season. So it's just absolutely a terrific job that Corey Mace has brought to it. I give full credit to him just changing the culture, the accountability, clearly bringing in the right guys, the kind of players that kind of leadership group that will lead by example on and off the field. All those things are coming in with them. You say healthy, Huss, though, and this is where I think things get really interesting for Saskatchewan. They've ruled out AJ Ouellette, Kean Schaefer-Baker, one of their premier receivers. He's also injured. That's 2 key players, adding to a list that already has, of course, quarterback Trevor Harris and right tackle Jamarcus Hardrick. So those are 4, if you were to say the 4 most important players on the team, at least 3 of those guys would be mentioned in that conversation. And Kean Schaefer-Baker is an incredible receiver. And when he's at the top of his game, he's up there with anybody else. So they are going to be tested here, but it's just something about the way their defense is playing. Special teams is also on their P's and Q's. And you look at just the execution, right? They're not killing themselves with penalties as much as they were earlier in the year. And they're getting backed by a great home crowd now. I thought that, I think, it's great to see the Rider faithful show up. That was an early story in this season, how they weren't putting butts in seats. That wasn't the case this past weekend. But yeah, I think it's, I've said this for a long time, and even, I know I ride the Rough Riders, as hard as anybody in the media, but it's important that Saskatchewan has a competitive team. And this year, I know we're a third through the season, but I think I'm ready to agree with you. I think they are for real.
Listen, I've seen all I need to see that this team is legit. And the fact of the matter is that they've won these games. Like, they're the antithesis of the Bombers. They have won these games when they've been without some key players. And like, they might drop a game to Montreal. They could drop a game. Things could get tight. All I'll say is this. When things get cold and we get to the playoffs, Corey Mace is a championship level defense right now. And you can do a lot of things come playoff time where it's not as easy to throw for 400 yards Like that is in a lot of ways the way the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, like the offense finally caught up. They had a foundation of a championship level defense, and the Riders are no joke. And whether it's Winnipeg, whether it's BC, it's not going to be easy to put up points on them. And if they get Trevor Harris back and that offense kind of follows the lead of the defense, who knows how far this team could go.
It's not even taking into consideration Shea Paterson could get progressively better. I saw some things from him this past week that he's getting better.
How big is it for the team right now that he's getting all the reps that he's getting and getting some results right now? I mean, it's a great point. Like, Trevor Harris is going to be back next week or the week after. Well, nothing to say that he can't get hurt in week 15 or hurt in a playoff game. And to have your backup play as much as Paterson has and to get the results that he's had can only help this team going forward. So
100%.
For everyone here in Manitoba or in Alberta that love the Riders of the last couple of years, that limped their way through 7 consecutive losses to end the last 2 seasons, it's a different show in Regina right now, led by Corey Mace. It's not a different show in Edmonton right now. Chris Jones may be gone. They still find ways to lose. 0-6 on the season. And I haven't been taking part as much in these quarterback conversations because, for the most part, I think McLeod Bethel-Thompson, I don't think there's much of an argument that he gives them a better chance to win. The caveat is that they haven't won yet. And when they finally got a relatively good performance from their defense, the offense wasn't there last week. So, of course, you've got the conversations of what about Trey Ford? He showed glimpses in the last couple seasons that he could be a difference maker at the quarterback position. But questions now about how he's fitting into that team dynamic, Jeff, and that reports, well, you can talk about these reports that maybe he's been given some chances, but it wasn't exactly the way he wanted to go in, so he wasn't doing it. What is going on in Edmonton at the QB position?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it was big news to get McLeod Bethel-Thompson over the offseason, and I'm with you. I thought that McLeod Bethel-Thompson, given his experience, given his, his championship pedigree, if you will, when Toronto beat the Bombers, mind you, he didn't finish that game. But just, his presence, right? Like, he's a guy that has been consistent in this league for a long time. And if Edmonton needed anything, they needed consistency, and they needed consistency at the most important position. Trey Ford did a lot of exciting things. There's certainly something to be said that, he's accounted for a majority of Chris Jones's wins in Edmonton. So he has found that, ability to win games. We haven't seen that, of course, from McLeod Bethel-Thompson, but the reports that are coming out, I was listening to the Rod Peterson show, and Eddie Steele, one of my favorite, league analysts, just, him, he doesn't pull any punches. He's a great, a great analyst. He dropped what I thought was a bomb on the show, saying that Trey Ford's been offered, running packages, different packages, clearly not to his, to his standard, if you will, because the report is that he's turned them down. He doesn't want to be a gadget quarterback. He sees himself as a, legitimate quarterback, and if he's going to have these enhanced packages, he wants to be the go-to guy. That, to me, is, it's interesting because my first impression is to suggest attitude issues, right? What player in general, let alone a professional athlete, turns down opportunity? But then you start thinking about it a little bit more, and yes, does it make him look like a great team player? No. Should he be taking anything that's given to him? I would suggest yes, but that relationship between him and Chris Jones isn't exactly the smoothest of relationships between coach and quarterback. And we also know, and I've heard this from several quarterbacks across the league, is that Chris Jones' seemingly favorite thing to do is make his quarterback feel uneasy. So I don't know what the relationship, direct relationship was with Trey Ford and Chris Jones, outside of the fact that it clearly wasn't great and that he didn't agree with his decision to bring in, a new quarterback. He felt like the work he had put in the previous season was enough to, give him a shot at the very least competing for an opportunity to then be thrown in. Because here's the other part. We don't know, or at least I don't know, or at least that interview or any other subsequent interview I've heard hasn't talked about the the specifics of the packages that Ford got. So if he was just supposed to put his head down and run into a bunch of 300-pounders in the front line, yeah, maybe I would be turning it down too. But at the same time, it's, again, it's not a good look. But I do think it is interesting how this turns out by the end of the season. Just Trey Ford already got an opportunity to get into the game last week. Jarius Jackson, new head coach, offensive coordinator, talked about wanting to get him in. He didn't even promise that he would get him in last week, but he ultimately did. And what I thought was fascinating in McLeod Bethel Thompson's, seemingly weekly rant to Randy Ambrosie and the rest of the league is that he threw Trey Ford under the bus for quote unquote getting him out of a rhythm. Trey Ford played 2 series in the first quarter. He didn't even play the final 3 quarters. Like, McLeod Bethel Thompson is turning into the biggest baby in the CFL, and he's also the biggest loser in the CFL at 0-6. So I'd be more focused on winning games than talking about 5 days rest against the exact same team you played the week before and a young quarterback in that you said everything right when you got into Edmonton, that you were going to put him under your wing, that you were going to mentor him, that you were so impressed with what he did the year before. And the first instance you get a chance to talk about his playing time, you talk about Trey Ford taking you out of a rhythm. Breaking news, McLeod Bethel Thompson, you haven't been in a rhythm all season.
Yeah, well, the team hasn't been, that's for sure. I mean, like,
he's had some good games, but he hasn't been in a rhythm and dominated. Like,
no, I mean, but
you put 50, 60 yards every pass if it was up to him. He'd have 700 yards in a game. His team would lose all 18 games.
The Ford, listen, Ford's time in Edmonton is fascinating. And, obviously Chris Jones is a huge part of the story. We kind of came in last year, coming out of a 4-14 season where he had shown glimpses in his rookie year. He was the 3rd string quarterback coming out of camp. So, I think that there is something to whether it's the attitude, whether it's how he reacted to the way he was being treated, Chris Jones, and that is absolutely fair. Bottom line is it took until they were 0-9 and the season was over for him to really get in and get any legitimate chances.
I have no doubt in my mind Chris Jones didn't play him because he's Canadian, because he was at a Canadian program and didn't want to put the future of his career in this league to a guy who played U Sports. I honestly believe that. I think he drafted him in the first round to turn him into a different position. He drafted him because he's an athlete. He didn't draft him to be the future Edmonton quarterback. No, not even close. He just athleticized his way into that role. And when he showed up, and this is where I give credit to Trey Ford and anybody who fights for themselves at their workplace of workmate, is that you need to fight for your opportunity, and that's what he did.
Listen, if they keep on losing, he'll get an opportunity to get in there at some point. But I have to think that just the aftermath of this entire Chris Jones era is going to end up on a massive reset button pressed again on the Edmonton Elks, a new guy taking over, new ownership taking over. And, as we talked about
house by the end of the year.
Oh yeah, exactly. And like the lasting memories of the Chris Jones era in Edmonton will be a regime that almost ended the franchise, made it turn over to public ownership. And listen, for the good of the league, you just hope that competent people get in there, do the work in the community to win back the fans, and whoever's running the football operation knows what the hell they're doing, and they can get back to being a competitive team in the Canadian Football League. Speaking of being competitive, we had similar conversations about the Ticats. And how about that? They get off the mat, beating their arch rival Toronto Argonauts to get win number 1 of the season. I guarantee you the week of practice was a hell of a lot better in the Hammer than it was in Edmonton.
Well, man, like, it's just, you hear it in any team, winning cures all. In this case, it doesn't put them in a position, particularly a playoff position, or get them anywhere. I guess it gets them technically closer to one, but they just needed to have something go right for them. Some of those games they gave them away. Other games they were just putrid. I think it carries an extra meaning. I think there's angst that comes into play when you hit, what were they, 0-6 at that point, or it was for them. They just need to win a game, and to have a Toronto team, their arch rival, come into their barn, into the Hammer. I mean, this was the perfect setting for them to get it done. And the crazy part, Huss, is they almost didn't. And so it was one of those where it was like, it looked like it was sure. And then Janarian Grant decided to make it a close game by the end. But, good for them to pull it out. You don't want to have teams and fan bases checking out of the season by the halfway mark. And, that's where you're headed when you're 0-6. So, for the Ticats, it's is it the start of something? Probably not. There's a lot of issues with Hamilton. Bo Levi Mitchell, ironically, isn't seeming to be one of them. He's kind of taken a step back from the first few weeks, but it's just that defense isn't that great. Special teams also a bit of a sore spot, and just But that's the thing. Like the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they got on a bit. They were able to win back-to-back games. Now for the Hamilton, it's to stack on those wins, because the crazy part is you're getting help in the West. The East isn't all that big and bad. So, you're still very much in the conversation at this point for a playoff.
The thing about it is the records. I mean, like what Ottawa's done so far has sort of changed things. Like they got one win, but I mean, Montreal's on the top of the division. Ottawa has 4, and we'll talk about them in just a sec. And I think Toronto's still a pretty good football team, especially, depending on what happens with Chad Kelly back and if they can get up there. So there was absolutely no option to go to 0-6. They got to rattle off some wins. They got to win some head-to-head matchups and get their way into it. They took a big step forward doing that with their first win of the season. I just mentioned Ottawa, and we'll get to the rising teams right now, and it gets us to a really interesting matchup in the nation's capital on Friday night. Calgary's going to Ottawa. This is basically a pick 'em. Calgary's a 1-point favorite, and minus 114 on the money line over at CoolBet. Calgary coming off that big win where they almost gave it away late against BC, but they didn't. They are 0-3 on the road. They're 3-0 at home, but coming off such a big win against the top team in the West going into last week against an Ottawa team that, listen, credit where credit is due. You are what your record is. They're 4-2. They beat a Bomber team that had 3 cracks on the goal line or from the 7-yard line on the last drive. And then they've beaten the Elks twice and the Ticats, none of them who had won a game at this point. Who are you higher on right now going into this week? The 3-3 Calgary Stampeders or the Ottawa Red Blacks, who have beaten who's been on the schedule so far? It's a really intriguing matchup from two teams that I think are both feeling pretty good about where they're at right now, considering their expectations going into the season and what we saw last year.
You know what? I was weighing it back and forth between the two teams. I still think I like Ottawa a little bit more. I like what Drew Brown's doing there. I like the consistency he's bringing to the quarterback position. I like the weapons that they have. I think they have an improved O-line. Their defense has been good. Once Dedmon comes back, they'll have their star returner back in the mix, a guy who can turn the game. That even though they were 4-14 the last 2 years, I mean, this was a guy who was turning games, giving a guy who was almost single-handedly giving Ottawa opportunities to win. So you know how big his impact is. I just really like what's going on in the nation's capital. I like the attitude. I like the leadership there. They have really deep quarterbacks behind Drew Brown, so if there's an injury there, it's fine. I just said, and the reason why I was weighing back and forth between Calgary is because I think Dave Dickinson is just a really good coach. I think he has great game plans. He gets his team ready to go. He was dealing with an extremely young club last season. They're a bit more mature this year, but I still see some of those mistakes. I still see some of those games that they've won where they could have easily lost. As you mentioned, I mean, if Seontae Evans can get a handle on that ball, Vernon Adams needs like 7 or 8 yards to kick a winning field goal in that game. And we're not talking about this question. You can, like you brought up, you can say some of the same things against Ottawa, including the victory over Winnipeg with that hour-long weather delay, that if they would have brought Chris Strevler out from the 7-yard line, 1st and goal, probably win that game. And Ottawa is not 4-2. They're suddenly 3-3. And again, we're maybe having this conversation, but you could go up and down the list of all 9 teams and talk about how one play would be the difference between the game. The Bombers could be 5-2. The Bombers could be 0-7. Maybe outside of that one strong
Elks
game
could
they had
be
against
4-2 or 5-1.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the fact of the matter is the good teams find ways to win, and I like that both teams are taking steps. I like that both teams are making each respective division earn that playoff spot. Whereas it's been tough sledding for both those organizations, at least the last year or so. So I just, I think there's good things brewing on both sides. I see better talent on the field in Ottawa, and I see better coaching on the sideline in Calgary, if that makes sense. And right now I'm giving the edge to Ottawa. I'm going with talent over coaching, Huss.
Just before we go, looking ahead to the week in the Canadian Football League, and I've just pulled up the Cool Bet lines. A little bit of line movement today. I thought that all 4 of these games, would probably end up within a field goal. We do have a 3.5 point spread with the Saskatchewan-Montreal game. Montreal's 3.5 point favorites right now. Mm-hmm. The Elks, for some reason, are now 3.5 point favorites against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. We just talked about the Calgary Ottawa game, and to me, fascinating game Saturday night. Winnipeg and Toronto. This game is a straight up pick 'em, -110 on either side. And Jeff, both teams that'll be participating will be in ornery moods coming off losses last week to their arch rivals, Hamilton, who beat the Argos, and as we mentioned, the Riders with that huge win over Winnipeg. It's going to be a really, really interesting game. We've talked a lot about the parity of the Canadian Football League. Wouldn't surprise me if we have 4 games that all go right down to the wire post the 3-minute warning in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I think this is the perfect weekend to describe the parity in this league. I think you need to look at the home side for these. I'm not saying the home side is going to be a clean sweep 4 for 4, but when these games are this tight, it's tough to win on the road. It's tough to, travel to another city and, whatever. I'm not saying it's impossible to wake up in a pretty nice hotel room and get ready for a game. I'm just saying it's difficult to win in, visitor facilities. It's just a greater element of difficulty. And if you look at some of these matchups, Huss, don't think that Cody Fajardo going to the 6-game list is somehow going to be the downfall of the Montreal Alouettes. I think they're a team that, particularly has 2 other strong phases in special teams and on defense, of course. They're getting some bodies back on both of those phases. And even on offense, man, I mean, Caleb Evans got thrusted into a position that was not enviable for any quarterback. He's sitting there watching one of the MOP front runners do his thing, and all of a sudden, Harris is grabbing Cody Fajardo is grabbing his hamstring at the first, and now he's thrust into it. Now, we saw some really good. We saw a long bomb touchdown. We saw some really bad and a pick 6. Caleb Evans has 12 starts under his belt in his career. He's got 15 starts under his belt in his career, including 2 last year in a very eerily similar situation where Cody Fajardo ended up missing a couple games, and Caleb Evans came in there and won both of them. So, I mean, I wouldn't be looking at the fact that they have to play Caleb Evans as some kind of, certainly isn't Cody Fajardo, but I think he'll be much better, especially with the bye week that Montreal is coming off of. Caleb Evans didn't leave the city. He stayed in Montreal for the entire week, knowing that he was going to start for this game. So he's been preparing for this game for a couple weeks. The other matchups we have that question. Who are you buying? The Ottawa Redblacks or the Calgary Stampeders? I think we're going to get our answer here. This to me is about as even as it gets. 2 teams that have had, some issues with consistency and inconsistency this season. And I just see it as 2 teams. And that to me is the personality game. We'll see who shows up in that game. I think that one's going to take on a life of itself. And of course, Winnipeg, Toronto, I've said this on our, my Hit With Your show on Monday, Huss. Toronto is a very tough place to play for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Go look it up. It's not an easy place for them to play, especially with the challenges they're having now. There is a lot more urgency at this point in the season than we've seen in Winnipeg for quite some time. So maybe that takes on a different feeling. But that one's going to be a tough one for Winnipeg. And of course, I think you said Elks are the favorites in that game. I mean, I guess I guess the odds makers don't give a crap about the Ticats finding their first victory, but I still don't see good times coming in Edmonton. I see it too much as a whirlwind still. I see it too much as the shock from Chris Jones not being around, adjusting to a new coach. I knew there wasn't going to be a new coaching bump because they didn't bring in a new guy. They brought in the same people who were already in that building doing the same thing. So while Jarius Jackson might be able to add his fingerprints a little bit more in his second game as a head coach, I just don't see it, man. I see if the Hamilton Tiger Cats can figure out their defensive game and somehow, find a way to limit, McLeod Bethel Thompson and or Trey Ford, I think that this is a chance for them to go, back-to-back victories.
I like, now that the early game, the Thursday game and the Sunday games are at 3.5, I'm going to be taking the points right now before those go the other way. I think both of those end up being tight. I hear everything you're saying about Caleb Evans. He's still got to go against that Rider defense, which I think has the goods to keep them in any game. And, listen, this game for the Bombers, 2-6 going into a home against BC. It's been a long time since we've said they absolutely have to have a game against the East on the road. That's the case. It should be a good one. And lowest total for the week is that 48 in the Saskatchewan-Montreal game. I wouldn't be surprised if that game kind of resembles the Winnipeg-Saskatchewan game last week that ended up 19-9. Overall, a great show today, and this is going to be a great week coming up. Hammer, thanks so much for the time as always. Thanks to everyone that joined us on YouTube. If you're watching after the fact, tell a friend about CFL 110 and throw a comment about your favorite team in the comments here on YouTube. For everyone listening on podcast, thanks so much for making us a part of your CFL routine. And again, a huge thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg for presenting CFL 110. Check them out online, wherever you are, at garageliving.com. And for those of you in the Manitoba and Saskatchewan area, for more information on how you can completely revolutionize your garage and add to the value of your home, give Pat Knuga a call, 204-999-1234. For Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Enjoy the games this week, and we'll see you next week right here on CFL 110.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.